Welcome everyone to the Why There Are No George Floyds in Cuba. We are glad to have you all here. We welcome you here wherever you are in the world. We have a great lineup for everyone, and I wanted to start off by introducing the speaker for today, which is my lovely colleague Nesbitt Crunchfield, and he will take it from here.
Good afternoon and evening. Welcome to the USA-Canada-Cuba Normalization Conference webinar, Why There Are No George Floyds in Cuba. This is our 8th webinar and the most appropriately entitled, where we're seizing the time. We're dealing with trying to discuss, teach, and inform and talk to each other about the existence of this catastrophic, violent, unaccountable, racist police actions and forces sponsored and encouraged by the United States, as opposed to the security, policing, and security controlled and composed of the people of revolutionary Cuba. My name is Nesbitt Crutchfield. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm speaking to you from Stolen Alani territory, also known as Richmond, California. People may have heard about the unfortunate incident that occurred in Cuba in June 24th, where a young Black man was killed by the National Revolutionary Police in Cuba. This is a very unfortunate and very heartbreaking situation, and we're going to talk about that in detail. Our panelists will cover it in detail, and we will also cover it in our question and answers session. I think it's important for me to say that I have been to Cuba over 5 times myself as a Black man, and it was clear to me that when I was there that the socialist revolution was still developing. It has not been completed. It is not fair for us to present to you Cuba as being the perfect place. It is not, but it is a revolutionary Cuba. It is a place where we can go and see where our future holds us in reference to people's power and people's participation in their own governance. On the 25th of March, when George Floyd was murdered for over 8 minutes in front of the world, this was a very tragic incident, but it's not the only incident where Black people, people of color, and indigenous people, poor people were killed. We have George Floyd, we have Breonna Taylor, we have Stephen Clark, we have Philando Castillo, we have Eric Gardner. I can't name any more names because I won't be able to finish this introduction. It's clear to us that this is a violent, intimidating death perpetrated by the police in this country, sanctioned and controlled by this white supremacist capitalist government, and led by a president who gives a speech on stolen indigenous land, rails against demonstrators, and talks about protecting statues and symbols of dead Confederate traitors. We have a number of panelists tonight that will reflect Cuba scholars, speakers from the Cuban Embassy, speakers from labor, the ILWU, speakers from the Black struggle in the tradition of Robert Williams and Malcolm X. Our panelists will reflect Cuba's contribution to the to the struggle for Black liberation, Black Lives Matter, Black liberation, and anti-police violence and brutality. We have two outstanding and brilliant co-chairs who will carry this program and this webinars from here on. It's Jamela Bourdin from the All African People's Revolutionary Party, and Kennedy Gilfinger, Universal Zulu Nation Hip Hop for Humanity Committee. Take it, Jamela.
Thank you, Nesbitt. Yes, my name is Jamila Bourdin, organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I've been doing this work for over half my life. I've been organizing with the party for 7 years. And the larger picture of liberation, which is connected to the Cuban struggle with the African struggle, is quite crucial. So this evening is absolutely important, and I'm very, very happy to be here. We do have the person who wrote the piece which inspired this webinar, Why There Are No George Floyds in Cuba, will be speaking, I guess, depending on where you're on the map, this afternoon, this evening, this morning. And there are so many, many people from all walks of life who have been doing this work, who are contributing greatly. So I am once again very, very honored to be in the presence of so many people. And I myself am on Algonquin people's land, New Jersey. So I definitely want to honor that as well. And I want to pass the torch to my comrade, Kimberly. Or Kennedy. I'm so sorry, Kennedy.
No worries, it's Kennedy. No worries. Thank you, Jamela. It's been a pleasure. Peace, everybody. My name is Kennedy Geffinger. I am an educator. I am a community activist, organizer, healer, mother, all that good stuff. So I'm proud to be here and honored to be here. I have a lot of affiliations and work within the Universal Zulu Nation. I do a lot of work with the African American Day Parade based here in New York City. I am an educator as well in a community center based in Harlem, and I do a ton of work, and I am so honored to be here to be able to speak and hear everyone and what's been going on. And I'm so excited to talk about movement and action that's going to happen in our communities and is happening, and it's an honor to see Cuba be on the front line of this. So I'm happy to be here and to be co-chairing this. And I wanted to start this off by passing it to our first lucky panelist. His name is August Nims. He is the author of Why There Are No George Floyds in Cuba, aka our name of this programming. So it's an honor to have you here. The core coordinator of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, professor of political science and African American and African Studies, University of Minnesota co-author with Esteban Morales, The Dynamics of Racial Discrimination in Cuba, Past and Present. He's an author, Marxist versus Liberalism, and comparative real-time political analyst. So it's an honor to have you here, August Nims, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kennedy. It's a pleasure to work with you once again. Let me begin. Last year, 2019, in the United States, 14 African Americans, unarmed, were killed by the police. That figure was down from 38 in 2015, when the Washington Post began collecting data. It's the most credible database that we have. This means, using the most conservative figures and criteria, that scores of unarmed African Americans, all out of proportion to our percentage of the population, are killed each year by the police. It is this fact that I'm referring to when I say there are no George Floyds in Cuba. The argument I make is that the yearly killings of scores of unarmed people with roots in Africa by the police does not happen in Cuba. And imagine something that pains me to think about: how many people are killed by the police, regardless of skin color, whose deaths are not captured on camera or recorded on video. So when we are protesting what happened to George Floyd, we are protesting all of those other unseen murders. Even the Cuban Revolution's most unrepentant enemies have to admit that the George Floyd phenomenon doesn't exist in Cuba. A couple of weeks ago, as Nesbitt pointed out, when a 26-year-old unarmed Black Cuban male was tragically killed by the police, some of those enemies of the Cuban Revolution tried to claim that this was Cuba's George Floyd moment. Exactly because this was such an unusual incident, they were not able to convince enough Cubans to take to the streets to protest what happened. The vast majority of Cubans of all skin colors knew better, whatever their opinions about how the Cuban police reported the death. We can discuss what happened during the question and answer period. My point is that the recent and rare police killing in Cuba was in no way an example of what regularly occurs in the United States. But has the Cuban reality I'm describing, has that always been the case? No. Before January 1st, 1959, the hated US-backed Fulgencio Batista regime that was overthrown in 1959 was notorious for its brutality. Its police were particularly bloody. A parent going to a police station in search of a missing son dreaded to hear the detested "Se llamaba" from the authority. That was his name. And here I want to make a correction to what I wrote in my article. Rather than saying "Se llamaba," that's what he used to be called, I had "se estaba," meaning that's what he used to be. This was the term, again, "se llamaba," that the police taunted parents with who were looking for their disappeared sons. In other words, they were saying, he's history. This is what he used to be called, "se llamaba." That was his name. This term was so hated in Cuba that in a famous speech that Fidel Castro gave in 1960, in which he was listing the names of US corporations that were being nationalized, and every time he would mention a name, such as United Fruit, the crowd would roar back, "Se llamaba." It used to be called, that was its name. In other words, it registers how well known this detested term used by the police to taunt parents was within Cuba. An example of the rampant brutality of the police in Cuba. Even the New York Times on January 2nd and 3rd, 1959, praised Fidel Castro and the rebel army for overthrowing Batista. Yes, the New York Times. Go back and read January 2nd and 3rd in their editorials. They praised Fidel Castro and the rebel army for overthrowing the Batista regime exactly because it was such a horrific and bloodthirsty regime. And this is why many of the police assassins, some of whom were Black, were tried and executed within months of the revolution's triumph on January 1st, 1959, to the applause of hundreds of thousands of Cubans. But am I guilty of comparing apples and oranges, two very different societies? The history of both societies suggests otherwise. Some argue that the murder of George Floyd has its origins in the institution of racial slavery. If that's true, then we should expect to see similar outcomes in Cuba. Racial slavery existed in Cuba for almost a century before coming to what would become the United States. and racial slavery outlived America's peculiar institution by 2 decades, from 1865 to 1884. But again, the George Floyd phenomenon does not exist in Cuba. Think also of another country in the Americas with a long history of racial slavery, and I'm referring to Brazil, and where the police kill scores of blacks monthly, not yearly, with impunity. So therefore, what explains, quote unquote, Cuban exceptionalism? Why is Cuba different? Exactly what happened in 1959, the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. In a 25-month lead up to that victory on January 1st, 1959, the rebel army, once it liberated a piece of territory from Batista's despised military, realized that a police force was needed along with other social services like healthcare and education. That's the origin, by the way, of Cuba's highly praised healthcare and educational system. It started in the liberated areas. To be effective, the new police force, unlike its predecessor, depended on the support and active cooperation of the people living in the area. This practice of rebel army cooperation with the local population informed the rebel army when it forced Batista to flee the island on the 31st of December, 1958. In collaboration with the mass-based underground, the July 26 movement, a general strike took place the following day. Key to its success was the seizure of police stations, and it was a relatively easy and bloodless operation, owing precisely to the mass character of the general strike. Rank and file police surrendered or tried to blend into the crowds. What the New York Times reported on January 6, 1959, the 5th day of the triumph of the revolution, speaks volumes about the radical transformation that was underway. The New York Times reported, quote, "No police are on the streets since they are held in quarters, and all officers are under arrest. A few police patrol cars are circulating, occupied by 2 policemen and 2 members of the rebel army." I love that image. 2 members of the rebel army in the back seat, keeping an eye on the 2 police who are driving it. The article goes on to say, Boy Scouts are directing traffic in some places, unquote. Thus began the simultaneous top-down, bottom-up reinvention of Cuba's police. The rebel army commander who headed up the police in the liberated areas became the national head of Cuba's new police force. The intimate collaboration between the rebel army and the local population to police an area generalized to the entire country. The Cubans could do what they did because they had a revolutionary leadership in place that had learned from the mistakes with a failed previous general strike in April of 1958. I confess that I had a moment of elation when seeing the 3rd Precinct Station here in Minneapolis on fire on May 28th because of the protests. But then I remembered what I knew about what happened in Cuba on January 1st, 1959. Rather than burn down the police stations, the revolutionary leadership organized the masses to overtake and to occupy the police stations and to transform them into institutions to actually serve working class people for the first time. It's a lesson we should never forget. The result today is that unlike in the United States, especially in communities of color, Cubans do not see the police as a foreign occupation force. They are willing to cooperate with them in a way that simply doesn't exist in the United States. And see, as you've seen on the screen, Allison Bodine was able to put up insider eyewitness report for one of the participants in the takeover of the police station, Katia Dayano. There's another more recent account by Mark Kruger entitled Community, but that's the piece by Katia Dayano. That's her That's her eyewitness account. Again, she was a participant in the July 26th movement and part of the process of taking over the police station. There's another article by Mark Kruger, and that article written in 2007, it's an academic article, but it provides great detail about how the police operate in Cuba today. And more recently, I recommend an article by Reese Ehrlich, which also provides details about the, yes, that's the article by Mark Kruger, Community-Based Crime Control in Cuba. And we'll make links available for people to be able to access these articles afterwards. For those who fault America's original sin for George Floyd's murder, Cuba teaches that history is not destiny. In other words, the fact that a society once had a long history of racial slavery does not result inevitably in outcomes as in the United States and Brazil. That is the wanton police killing of its citizens who have roots in Africa. Despite the revolution's continuing challenges on the race question, which we can discuss during the Q&A, what happened to George Floyd does not happen in Cuba. A Black person in Cuba has a better chance of being alive after an encounter with the police than their Black brothers and sisters in not only the United States, but Brazil or anywhere else in the Americas. Even its severest critics have to admit to this. The reason, again, is that the Cubans made a revolution, specifically a working class revolution, the class in which the people of African origin are disproportionately members of, owing to the institution of racial slavery. For the first time in Cuba's history, the working class masses became the rulers of Cuba. And therein is the fundamental reason, again, why a person of African roots in Cuba has a better chance of not losing their lives in an encounter with the police than in any other country in the Americas, including the US. Is there a better explanation for what that also important life and death fact about Cuba? If there is, then I'm willing to hear it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. This has just inspired me. We just started it and I'm just so inspired. And I do want to announce the Cuban ambassador to the US, Jose Cabañas, is listening to the webinar. So thank you so much. And the international presence is just showing you how crucial this struggle is. We don't live in a bubble. We don't live in a vacuum. We're all connected to the struggle. So anyone in the streets needs to understand we don't live in the vacuum. So I really want to appreciate everything that's happening right now. And I'm sitting with it myself. And whew, our next speaker is Rodney A. Gonzalez Mesri, and he's the counselor to the Cuban Embassy in Washington, D.C., October 2018. He has a master's degree in international relations, 2011, and a major in economics, University of Havana, in 2005. Thank you so much. Is Rodney there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you great.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jamila, for this opportunity. And really, first of all, we would like to appreciate, the audience and the organizers of this wonderful opportunity to really exchange about these important issues. I think Professor Nimes made just an incredible introduction for the arguments that myself and my colleague Janet, that is coming afterwards, are going to be presenting this night, afternoon, or morning, as you mentioned before. We totally agree that that in order to answer to the question that entitles this panel, we need to very modestly recognize the Cuban Revolution contribution, both in terms of establishing a different culture, in terms of racial relations within the island, and the transformation that the revolution brought about as to the police system. So we all agree, I think it's common knowledge, that the racism has a root in slavery. I mean, obviously we're talking about this issue today because slavery was deeply rooted in the whole world, in America included, and also in different countries. I mean, this scourge ended up denigrating the human condition, not only of those who suffer slavery, but those who exerted actually, those who enslaved people. So we think what really make a difference is the public policies. Now you see me?
You can see you, yeah.
Okay. So I think actually the Cuban Revolution, represented a change in philosophy, a change in paradigm. The Cuban Revolution, let's say, implicated a transformational change as to every aspect of the Cuban life. And of course, racism had no place in it. So as a revolution that became socialist and had a deeply popular basis, it started to have a different referential figures, a different history, a different way to look back to history in order to build a different future. So, and figures and histories that were just silenced during the Batista regime, as Professor Nims referred to before, began to have a different role in the Cuban society. We had Jose Marti as an inspiring figure, the national hero. Jose Marti, as you remember, was the one that lived in the United States for 14 years and had the job of organizing the Cuban struggles for independence during the late part. But the war itself against Spain was an organizing effort in order to bring about all races in Cuba. So if we can talk about races, the Cuban Revolution brought about also the concept that actually the race is a political construct. It's not a scientific construction, actually. So it is a political construction that mankind invented in order to subjugate other groups. So the Cuban Revolution tried to erase that. So there is a different philosophy that came with the revolution. We have to remember that what is considered, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, the father of the homeland, Cuba, liberated his own slaves as an act of, let's say, rebelliousness against Spain, and asked his own slaves to join the Cuban struggle against Spain. So this was imitated by several slaveholders, and it meant a lot to the formation of the nationality. It meant a lot to the need of taking across the country the nascent revolution. So those are just a few examples of how a new reference was brought about by the Cuban Revolution. So obviously, and the Cuban government in the early 60s adopted concrete policies in order to erase racial discrimination and any other form of discrimination. We had a new constitution in 1976, and it was reformed back in 1992. Racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination were just prohibited. So, and all along several policies were implemented in order to actually take to the real life our constitutions and the new laws of the Cuban Revolution. So with this rich heritage we have, of course, a new form of thinking was brought to life with the Cuban Revolution. We, during the economic crisis of the 1990s, several forms of racial discrimination and racism arose again and reappeared in the Cuban society. And of course, we thought that this was a problem that was not there anymore. But of course, with the economic crisis we faced in the 1990s, this reappeared again, and from the Cuban government down, I mean, all components of the Cuban government, I mean, the parliament, the council of ministers, began to think on ways, the civil society, of course, began to way of things to tackle these issues, the scourge of the Cuban society. And as as an example, I can mention the formation of the José Antonio Aponte Commission. José Antonio Aponte was a black man, a free black man that in 1812 actually led the first movement in Cuba in order to carry out a revolution and a movement that was anti-slavery and of national independence. So taking that figure to the present, the José Antonio Aponte Commission was created back in 2009, led by the Union of Writers and Artists of Cuba, in order to analyze, to research, do the proper research in order to erase and eradicate racism from a cultural point of view. We realized that racism, before all, let's say, is an act of culture or anti-culture. So it has deep cultural roots. It manifests itself in Cuba in very subtle ways. It's very subjective, let's say, a manifestation of different sentiments that human beings have. So as a society, we thought that racism should be fought from a cultural standpoint. So, and of course, it has the Cuban internationalism as a principle of the Cuban Revolution has also a race component, since we think that the national vision we have to fight for the rights of marginalized communities can be somehow shown to the world as an example. And of course, we helped a country as Angola in the 1970s and 1980s fight against the apartheid. 300,000 Cubans were there, and successfully we helped Angolans eradicate apartheid and built a new society there. And fast forward to the present, most of the countries that are benefiting from the Cuban internationalism in the area of health and the fight against COVID-19 are basically Africa and Latin America. As you know, the Latin American School of Medicine was created back in 1999 by an idea of Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro. And in 20 years, 30,000 young people have graduated from underserved communities in their respective countries. Half of them of Black origin, 1/3 of Hispanic heritage. So the only pledge they take is to give back to their own community and to fight for the rights of the community they belong to. And those are, a few examples of how the national vision we have as to race relations, as to equality, as to the right to have a society that is inclusive may translate somehow into the international arena. And with that, I think I'm yielding back the floor.
Thank you so much, Rodney Gonzalez Mastre. We really appreciate your words and what all you said in representation from Cuba. Next on the floor, we have Jeanette, and pardon me if I pronounce this wrong, Pamarega, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. She is the 3rd secretary for the Cuba Embassy in Washington, D.C.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Good evening and good afternoon, everyone. This is a real pleasure to attend to this panel. Thank you so much for the invite. For us, it's a very good pleasure to be here to share our experience. I mean, the experience of the Cuban government, the Cuban revolutions, and the importance that the revolution gives to these important matters when it comes to social equality, when it comes to anti-racism in Cuba. I think you all will agree that this issue can be seen from different approaches. In Cuba, as my colleague Rodney was referring to, it has to do with the understanding and the recognition of the historical heritage in Cuba, in the social community there, that has to do with the roots of the slavery and the fights of the revolution. And of course, the very important role that the Cuban state has played of this for the awareness on the consciousness of the society of this important inclusion matter. But also this issue, we would say, can be seen from a different perspective that has to do with the legal protection of people in Cuba, and also regarding the regulation of the police in Cuba. I appreciate very much the presentation that Mr. Nims made. It was very, very representative of the police and the institutions in Cuba. When it comes to policing, we have to look back as well as to the history. The current police body, the National Revolutionary Police, that has its origin in the rebel army and the rebel police in Cuba, was born in close, I would say, collaboration with the citizenship at the time that were very supportive of the triumph of the revolution and the consolidation of the Cuban revolution there. It is well known, the history of brutality and corruption of the police body during the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. That's why right after the triumph of the revolution, one of the main tasks of the Cuban revolutionary government was to get rid and to eliminate those mess, I would say, that inherited from the Batista dictatorship. That's why in parallel of improving the functions of the police, when it comes to law enforcement roles, it also has been implemented aspects of the community-oriented models. In that way, has been a very important role in Cuba to implement what it has to do with prevention and prophylactic functions of the police. This close relation of the police and the society that our revolutionary government at the time and now would like to better improve in the future, it is very good and very important in the way that the society and the police are looked, each other. As an example, I could refer, we have that in Cuba, what is called the chief of the police sector, that is grassroots, level in the police society. That is a figure there in the society very close to them that do mainly prevention and prophylactic. And this is one of the important things in the relations with both of them. Also, we have another, I would say, mid-level in the representative system of Cuba that is called the popular councils. And there is also a prevention community there where the police also have its roles. So the models and the modern times ask the societies to improve in this what it has to do with prevention and community oriented models. Of course, there are still many things that can be done down there, and the Cuban government recognizes that. As an example, I would say that different projects have been carried out to continue improving the police institution there in Cuba. For example, one of the most, I would say, comprehensive and recent ones was the one that is named Alma Mater project, conducted in 2012 in close relations with the university. This project has been led by the proper Ministry of Interior of Cuba, under which it is the police institution. It shows also the willingness to continue improving the institution there. The main goal of this is to provide recommendations from the universities and researchers on how to better improve the performance of the police down there, how to better increase the prevention task and role of the police down there, but also how to improve their participation in the criminal proceedings in Cuba. This project has shown very good outcomes there in Cuba, and many of them have been implemented already. But as I was referring, this issue also have another perspective, that is a legal perspective. And it is very important that, of course, the limit of the performing of the police is precisely the rights and the guarantees of the people. The Cuban Revolution have a very good, tradition with the based on the programs of social equality, in the inclusion on the constitution, for the constitutional protection, the prohibition of any kind of discrimination in Cuba based on race, based on sex, based on the place you live now. Recently, the constitution that was enacted and overwhelmingly approved in Cuba in 2018, very recently, our new constitution, also include, again, this article offering protection for everybody, not just based in race, but also is part of a big program of inclusion in Cuba that was conducted since the triumph of the revolution by Fidel Castro, but also with the heritage and the principles of our national hero, Jose Marti. Since then, we have this protection in the Constitution, but also another, I would say, conquest we had with this recent Constitution has been the expansion of more guarantees for the people in front of the law, in front of the police perform. It has to do with the guarantees also based on international models of the due process in Cuba. Based on that, the due process has been recognized in our legal system for many decades, but also as an expression of the willingness of the Cuban government to increase the protection of this, has been upgraded to the level of the constitutional protection. Also has been enhanced and the scope of other legal guarantees, such as the habeas corpus in the Constitution of Cuba. I'm not sure many constitutions around the world have it in the Constitution, so it's a good, it's a very significant conquest for the Cuban people. Have this in the Constitution, and based on that, you can, for example, report to any illegal detention down there. So in general terms, there has been the key, aspects based on the policing and legal perspective that has been key. Also, the participation and the role of the states for us to show, these outcomes that many people around the world recognize that Cuba has now these levels of impunity, levels of police brutality. I know that the time is reduced. I would prefer to leave it here and maybe open to answer some questions in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janet. I do want to announce that we do have a delay for some of our guests. So if Ike is ready to speak, if Ike is here, Ike is Ike Nahum. He is part of the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Committee. And there is an update on the International Cuba Conference as well as the UN vote.
Yes, thank you, Kennedy. It's our group came together. This is actually, as Brother Nesbitt said, our 9th webinar that we've organized since we had to reschedule the International Cuba Conference that was scheduled to take place last March 21st and 22nd in New York City. We put together a remarkable coalition here and around the world and in Canada of groups that were united to fight and to try to defeat, finally, once and for all, the U.S. blockade. Because, and we've had these webinars to bring about that goal, to bring forces together that have come together. And when we heard on May 25th that our brother George Floyd was murdered, and we saw the mass struggles and mass mobilizations and upsurge across the United States and around the world, we knew that our movement, we wanted to bring the experience and the example of the Cuban Revolution, and we know that that experience would be find resonance among the young activists and the older activists and all the people that have been brought into the streets around this. And that's what we've done, and it's reflected in our program. Please go to our website, if somebody can put it, if they already have it in the chat, us-cubanormalization.org, which will talk about and which has all of these wonderful webinars on video. Literally thousands of people have listened to these and attended these, and we're approaching 400 directly tonight and on Facebook. We have launched the Saving Lives campaign to highlight Cuba's incredible internationalism during this ongoing pandemic. 38 medical brigades in over 31 countries, and this news is mostly suppressed in the United States. And we're fighting that because, and I'll close on this, it's very important as we continue with this program that we understand that while this example of Cuba, of internationalism, of medical internationalism, of the medical brigades, while this is going on and the world sees this amazing example and talks about it, at the same time, the blockade, the economic and political war and threats against Cuba is deepening as we speak. And that is something that we exist to fight. So thank you. Let's continue with this wonderful program. Go on the website and let's build this movement. We're rescheduling this conference for November 14th and 15th. If we're able to have it, stay tuned for that. We'll make a decision soon on the form that it will take. And we look forward to the vote in the United Nations, October 25th and 26th, which will again be a resounding no to the U.S. aggression. So thank you very much for this wonderful program, and there's much more great stuff to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Ike. We appreciate all that information about what's happening here in New York City and all across the world with the Cuba movement. I am happy to introduce another colleague. Her name is Sophia Elijah. She is a longtime activist, organizer, and friend of Cuba. Welcome, Sophia.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important event. It is always an honor to be able to add my voice in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution, and tonight is no different. I am a criminal defense lawyer by training, also a former law professor, researcher, and I have visited Cuba over 80 times in the past 25 years to study the criminal justice and prison systems in Cuba. It is clear to me that the systems in Cuba are fundamentally different from those in the United States and far more enlightened and advanced, and they are rooted in the history that has already been well articulated by my predecessors on this panel, so I won't go back over that history. I will say that I've had the opportunity to interview countless experts in Cuba, judges and lawyers and lay people and professors whose expertise focuses on these same areas. And all of those interviews have confirmed my understanding and appreciation of the different system in Cuba. I have visited prisons in Cuba. I have visited court proceedings. I have observed police conduct all over the country. I should pause and say I live in Brooklyn, just a few blocks away from where 2 police cars were caught on camera driving into protesters in the street who were protesting racism, police brutality, and the death of George Floyd. I was struck by the horror of the conduct of the police, but also reminded of how impossible it would be for such a thing to happen in Cuba. The role of the police in Cuba is tied to the amazing, enlightened view of the fact in Cuba that the people are the most important natural resource that the country has. And everything is geared towards improving and nurturing the people and helping people to realize their dreams. Those are realities that are foreign concepts in the United States. But they are at the foundation of why you will never have a George Floyd situation in Cuba. In the United States, the police take a view of us versus them. However, in Cuba, the police are part of the people. To be a police person, to serve on the police force, you have to be vetted by your community. And if you're vetted by your community, the likelihood that you're going to abuse your neighbors, your sons and daughters of your neighbors is highly unlikely and just does not happen in Cuba. What the world witnessed with the murder of George Floyd was a videotaped slow motion reminder of the insidious nature of systemic racism in the United States. The US has never made a wholesale commitment to eradicate racism from every aspect of the society. In stark contradiction to the commitment of the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution to continue to work to eradicate all vestiges of racism that could exist. The criminal justice system in Cuba is always evolving. Every single year that I would go back to Cuba, hyped up about what I had learned in the previous year and thinking that I really understood it well, I'd get there only to find that they had made more improvements on what I had thought was the most enlightened system that you could have already. And that is part of the beauty of a dynamic revolution, one that is always questioning and evolving and trying to improve so that it best serves the people. And it is that reality that provides hope to so many people here in the US who have taken to the streets, who are willing to challenge police brutality, challenge racism, challenge a system that doesn't value its people, that puts profits over people. And I am encouraged and have been encouraged over the past 25 years that the Cuban Revolution stands for something that Fidel so eloquently taught us a long time ago, that we are engaged in a battle of ideas. And I am thankful that we are experiencing and seeing in the youth of today in the United States the possibility that even between the Atlantic and the Pacific, on this stolen land from indigenous people, even here, a better world is possible. So with that, I'll close and I look forward to the question and answer period.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Oh, Coming up next, we have Gabriel Prawl, who's the president of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union Local 152. Also, is the leading organizer of an unprecedented work stoppage of ILW members up and down the West Coast in solidarity with Black Lives Matter against police murder and brutality. Gabriel.
Thank you for your invitation. One of the things I want to make clear is that I'm the past president of ILW Local 52 and president of the Seattle chapter, the 8th Philip Randolph. So I'm happy to be invited here and be part of this webinar. And first of all, as everyone knows, that the ILW took drastic action, and I say less than 3 weeks ago, all 29 ports on the West Coast was shut down to commemorate Juneteenth. All right, but I want to be clear on this momentous action that came as a great beacon of light and hope for millions of Black workers who had been seared in the withering injustice that we've seen in the action that was taken on George Floyd. Dr. King, 6 months prior to him being murdered, came to ILW Local 10 in San Francisco, which is one of the most militant locals in the ILW, and it's mostly Black members at that local. And he spoke to the ranking filers, and after he was finished speaking, he was made honorable member of ILW. And I want to mention Dr. King because Dr. King, in his famous speech, "I Have a Dream," he spoke about Black people living on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. And African American has still languished in the corner of America's society and find himself in exile in his own land. And I'm saying this because Juneteenth represents the Emancipation Proclamation, which years later, Blacks are still living in the vision of wanting to be free, but not. We're still experiencing the racism, the systemic racism and the police brutality that we was experiencing back then. You know, a brother by the name of Jack Rasmus wrote, and I'm expressing this, on what inspired a Black local, a local that's mostly Black, to call this action, because this action was called by ILW Local 10. And the killing of George Floyd was particularly reprehensive police murder. Let's call it like it is. It was clearly intended. It was merciless. It was sadistic. As the word has watched, Floyd was cuffed, face down on the street pleading for his life. And the more he pleaded, the more Derek Chauvin, the cop, seemed determined to unrelated intent on keeping his knee on Floyd's neck. The first 6 minutes, as Floyd pleaded for his life, even pitifully calling out his mothers at the end, a sure indication he felt it was nearing the last moment of life. But for the almost 3 minutes more, Chauvin's knees remained at Floyd's, had already lost consciousness. What angered those who observed, like myself, the murder most is the lack of mercy shown by Chauvin and his 3 complicit partners, officers. What they show was clearly intention kill. Chauvin appeared almost to take pleasure in keeping his knee on Floyd's neck for 3 minutes more after he lays unconscious, motionless. That made it particular sadistic murder. Now, ILW ranking filers, Black workers as myself, seeing something, and this is not the first time that ILW has taken action on police terror and murder. Back in October 23rd, 2010, ILW Local 10 shut down 5 Bay Area port, calling for the justice for Oscar Grant, jail for killer cop. After Oscar Grant was murdered by John Mesedick on the platform of the Fruitdale BART station in California, Oscar Grant's uncle came to Local 10 and addressed the membership. I believe what happened after that, he explained what happened to his nephew, and that was one of the first instant, I believe, that people was able to capture police terror on the cell phone. The murder of an unarmed Black man with handcuffs behind his back. That's when ILW membership decided to strike an action. And the Bay Area port was shut down for 8 hours on that time after. Now, I want to make it clear that the ILW has a history of confronting racism, supporting political prisoners, and fighting against police terror, because this is part of ILW history. Back in 1934, when the ILW was organizing, and every year, because of that, every year we celebrate Bloody Thursday, which is July 5th. We shut down our port for 24 hours on July 5th to commemorate Bloody Thursday. The date that commemorate the death of 2 particular men who were strikers on the 1931 strike. And I will call them up by name. That was Nick Woodors and Howard Perry were killed in San Francisco on Bloody Thursday, 1934. But they weren't the only one killed in that era, 1934. There was also 5 more strikers. One by the name of Dick Parker, and the other, John Knudsen, was shot in the middle of the night on May 15 while waiting at scab camp in San Pedro. And then there was 2 others, Shelby Dafton and Olaf Helland was killed here in Seattle. One was shot in the back and ambushed on June 30, and the other was killed by an exploded tear gas grenade during the Battle of Smith Cove on July 20. Now, there was another sailor that was killed in Hong Kong while in a fight with scab. Now, let's go back to 1934 again. And let's go to Minneapolis, the same place George Floyd was killed. In 1934, there was also a strike called and a killing of 2 Teamsters drivers. And that was called Bloody Friday. Same place George was killed. So labor has a history and our responsibility to be dealing with this issue when it comes to, because it's not only a race issue, but it's a class issue as well. And that put labor movement in the far front line of this issue that we're dealing with today. You know, in many instances, trade unionists just don't know about the history of police killing. They didn't know all the rank and file places like Minneapolis and San Francisco took on the National Guard, the police, the vigilantes, and the Ku Klux Klan. And it's important that I mention that because in our history in the ILW, we can go back and show, I can go back and talk about a series of action that the ILW take, including back in our first convention of the ILW, back in 1938, when KKK, the day before, the KKK burned a cross in front of the convention in Aberdeen, Washington, which was the intent was to disrupt this convention and this organizing meeting with ILW members. The result of that, the KKK got a beating from the ILW. They got whipped by the ILW. That was the result that came from that. And that shows that class and racism is in the same struggle. Now, I can go back on resolution that ILW passed in the past that addresses the same issues on racism. There was a resolution that was passed by the ILW back in and I believe this was back in 1947. And I'm just gonna put a little piece of it. Is the struggle the ILW must seek to build around itself every possible support so that the struggle of the ILW becomes known as the struggle for all people. And we have the Negro people standing foremost among the allies to who the ILW must look because of the historic suffering, because of the increase of lynch violence, because of the mass dissolution which major political parties on the trend toward a worse form of fascism than even they have yet known are in ferment against the same forces of reaction that our unions will be fighting on. And people need to recognize that the birth of the ILW only happened because we are a organizer by the name of a leader by the name of Harry Bridges, who back then in 1934, when the ILW was fighting for a 6-hour day, high and haul, fear, because what the employees using that tactic in those times was the shape up, what we call the shape up, which was discriminatory, picking who's going to get a job. And what they used the tactic that they always use, divide and conquer. So while the white longshore workers was striking, they was bringing in black workers from the south to cross the picket line. Now, Harry Bridges made a strategic move. He went to the black community, the black churches, and talked to the leaders and asked if blacks were to not cross the picket line when we have a contract and we win this contract, that there will be blacks brought into the union. And that's why in San Francisco right now, local 10, the majority are black right now. You know, I want to fast forward to 2020, June 4th. Washington, Martin Luther King Labor Council and the police union. On June 4th, as we all saw this action that happened and this killing that happened with George Floyd, so did every other union. And as we look today on the density of workers in the union today, the majority of unions are blacks, people of color, black and brown people are part of the union today, a very mass majority. And there was a resolution brought to the Martin Luther King Labor Council asking that the police union be expelled from the labor movement, from that council, because they don't belong there. Now, there was a massive retaliation from the police union and major labor union that are okay with keeping the police union in the labor movement. Unions I represent the AFL-CIO. Now, there was a second resolution that came the first resolution came from the Highland Education Association. The second one came from ACIU, and where I should back up a little, because the one that came from the education, island education, wanted them expelled immediately, right now. But the one came from ACIU and UFCW was giving them time to create some kind of acceptable, I would say, acceptable proposition as to what changes they can do to make the police or the cops better, which include admitting that they have a systemic racism within their system. Well, they didn't follow through. They had from the 4th to the 17th of June. 17th of June was the day that we had our delegates meeting. This is the day that there was going to be a decision made whether the police union was going to be expelled or not. Now, on the way to that decision, there was a pushback to try to keep the police union in there. Even a letter was sent to the head of the AFL-CIO, and I don't care to call his name at this point, but he was still pushing forward to keep the police union in the Labor Council. A partner of mine, a ILW member of ILW Local 19, we wrote I would say a letter to the labor movement, acknowledging the role that the police union played in the labor movement and the reason why they needed to be expelled. And it's a long letter, so I don't want to read the whole thing, but I'm gonna probably just say a little part of it that matter here. The fact that the police union play a different role from the working class. First of all, we the working class, we build the wealth. The police union protect that wealth. That means when we strike, when we protest, the bosses, the corporation call the police to protect their wealth. They push us back to arrest us and to beat us down if it's possible. That clearly represents a conflict of interest. We are two different entities there. Now, the role that the police play today, they are being, the labor movement and the density of workers have been falling, but we can see clearly the police union just keep growing and growing. And to have the police union in a labor organization where they carry guns and intimidate people like they did in the San Francisco Labor Council when they tried to push to get the police union out. Many people inform us that they received death threat, they received intimidation tactics, that kind of stuff that will try to eliminate the force to push the police out. I'm just overwhelmed to be one of the people that participated in encouraging working class people to make the right decision. And that's what happened in the Labor Council. When we, on the day of our confrontation with the labor movement on the right that wanted to keep the police union, they tried our tactic that could be possible. We first voted as delegate, and it was a 2/3 majority to get the police union out. But that was not enough. They decided, well, we're gonna do per cop count, which they thought that the major unions that was supporting the police, which was like the building trade, the
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Gabriel. If you could just put in your closing remarks and so we can move on to the next one. What you're saying is great. I just wanted to, we're on a time schedule, so.
Okay, I'm sorry I'm taking up so much time because there's so much material.
No problem at all. We're happy to hear this. This is vital information.
But the thing is that to close out is that we created a movement, and as we create this movement, we got to continue to do the fight. If you guys are paying attention to what's going on in Seattle, just a couple days ago, over the Friday, we had there was a protest on I-5, and someone drive up the wrong way at the traffic, and it looked like it was intentional, but hit two of the protesters, killing one of them. It is sad to see what's going on. It's sad to see that we still are dealing with the systemic racism and the tactics that the police role that they play in oppressing protesters and people that are rallying in the street. But I will close this out from here and be open for questions and ideas on what we can do next.
Thank you, Gabriel Prahl. We really appreciate it. So we're going to move on to our next panelist, who by the name of Ajamu Umi. He is an organizer, All African People's Revolutionary Party for 36 years. Ajamu does a weekly webinar series on subjects from formulating revolutionary parties and alternatives to the policing system. He has engaged in community defense for many years, standing in the face of armed white supremacists. Ajamu has contributed to formulating liberation schools for youth for Oregon and California, and around-the-clock anti-foreclosure house security and shutdowns. His writings can be seen at www.abetterworld.me. And we are happy to have you here.
Kennedy, thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you and appreciation to everybody here. This is truly an honor to participate in this event. Why there are no George Floyds in Cuba. So I just want to say thank you and appreciation to everybody listening, all the comrades, friends, family out there, all the undercover police. I'm glad everybody's here with us today to talk about this very important topic. And it reminds me, listening to everyone, it reminds me of when I was in Cuba in 1994. I had an outstanding experience there, got a chance to spend time with our sister Asada Shakur and meet many other wonderful people, our lovely brother, Harry Valigas, Pombo, who just recently made his physical transition. And when I came back, I was so inspired to talk about Cuba, talk about the Cuban Socialist Revolution. And I did that, and I've done that for almost the last 30 years since I was there, every chance I get. And one of the things that always comes up when I'm doing that is people here in the United Snakes of America are always quick to say, well, racism still exists in Cuba. And this is constantly a thing that's said. And so it's always important for me to make the kind of comparison we're making with this program today, and to talk about the fact that Cuba, certainly in the early days of the revolution, when you had what they call the auto financing period of the economy of the Cuban Socialist Revolution, where the primary product that was produced in Cuba was rice, and the Soviet Union bought it. And certainly there were issues there. But the brilliance, and especially I saw this when I was there during the special period, was the Cuban people having to come together and realize that it was on them to figure out a way out, and that they wanted to do it sticking to and being consistent with their socialist path. And by doing that, what they've been able to do is consolidate even farther their commitment to free education for everybody. And that's a critical thing, because even with the most backward ideas, if you have generations of quality education, and we know Cuba's socialist system has quality education, even the imperialist World Bank and the United Nations have to acknowledge the quality of Cuba's academic system. So we know they have that. So the fact that they have that, generations and generations of this quality education, people's views start to change. And on top of that, policies where African culture is supported by the government and funded, and LGBTQ existence is supported and funded and placed in the recent constitution. These are just examples of the quality of consciousness that grows in the social revolutionary element of Cuba's socialist revolutionary path. And that's an inspiration for all oppressed people all over the world. I just have to tell one quick funny story. It's been this has come up several times in the work that I do, where people want to come to me and they want to say that our great revolutionary son, Ernesto Che Guevara, well, he was a racist. And they want to point to some quote that they quoted him in the Motorcycle Diaries, which this backward country has made into some fantasy movie. And they want to use that. And I tell them all the time without hesitation, you know, we should have a tape recorder on you when you were 21 and 22 to hear what you said, what kind of names you called us before we start talking about our brother Ernesto Che Guevara. We can't judge him on what he said when he was 21. We're judging him on the fact he went to the Congo and risked his life for our people and set up the standard that our comrade ambassadors talked about earlier, where almost 500,000 Cuban troops saved Southern Africa from apartheid racism. That's the Che Guevara we know. You can't tell us nothing about our heroes. That's my daddy. So that's how we have to talk about these kind of things. When we talk about why there's no George Floyds in Cuba, there's no George Floyds because moral incentives are challenged to supersede material incentives in their socialist system. And they're trying to, as has been said, the police there are members of the community that are a part of the community that see themselves as in service to the community. Not the case here in the United Snakes of America, where police are nothing but the evolution of slave patrols. They were never put here to serve us, and they never will serve us. And I can just quote our great philosopher hip hop group NWA, F the police. That's how we need to see that here. They're never going to serve us. We have to create our own community defense to protect us from police and white supremacists. Ooh, same thing. So I'll just close by saying that the inspiration the Cuban Revolution provides to us is unprecedented. I have had the opportunity myself to participate with the Cuban embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, when I was there, in Accra, Ghana, when I was there, in Dakar, Senegal, when I was there, in Banjul, Gambia, when I was there, doing work for the All-African People's Revolutionary Party to bring about our objective of Pan-Africanism. And I just want to say the Cuban socialist example, the people over profit model, is the model that we use to engage in our on-the-ground work every day, every second, every minute, every week, every month, every year of our lives, and it will always be our institution. And just like Cuba came and defended Africa and has defended African people, we will always defend the Cuban Revolution. We stand one with our family in Cuba and all peace and justice loving people around the world. And with that, we just say thank you again for allowing us to participate in this wonderful panel. Forward ever, backwards never, and we are always struggling for revolution.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ajam. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh my goodness, I feel so inspired. Oh my goodness. Up next, we have Cesar Omar Sanchez, who is an organizer with the New York, New Jersey Cuba C Coalition, advisory board member of Pro Libertad, Free All Political Prisoners Campaign, Cuba Solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement. Cesar.
Hey, can everybody hear me? Good, great. Well, I just want to, first of all, I want to thank every panelist that's actually on this webinar. I'm so honored to be on this webinar. It's fantastic. It's such a crucial moment of our time, you know, with so much protest that's going on, with the Black Lives Matter protests, with Cuba still being under siege because of the illegal blockade. I think it's very important that we have to bring that into discussion, you know, and too many times, you know, it's hardly even heard in the media. And in many ways, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests and Cuba, in many ways, the media has in many ways suppressed it because they don't want to tell the people who's actually listening to this webinar and pretty much nationwide struggle that people, Black people and people of colors are being oppressed on a systemic, racist, oppressive system. Last year in 2018, I actually was in Cuba, and while I was in Cuba, I actually witnessed and learned so much, and I was very surprised to see how Black Cubans, shows and embraces their African heritage, the diaspora, in terms of culture, in terms of art, in terms of music, traditional music, and then if you juxtapose that with here in the United States, it's slightly different. That's not to say that here in the United States we do have, Black traditional, whether it's Black History Month, and oh man, happy June 10th. It's just that you see it more in Cuba from a revolutionary perspective, and I think now, as we've seen here, as the Black Lives Matter protests intensify, we're seeing a lot of changes. The doors has opened to a different dialogue of discussion where class is being discussed. You have now the systemic racism, the mass incarceration, as Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, points out correctly. It's like you have this system that has been exposed. And saying that, I've been so proud to be a part of the Black Lives Matter protest. And from that, it kind of evolved into more protests, whether it's the indigenous protests now. Then you have the Latinos against the ICE, oppressive cops, So saying that, I said I was very, very blessed and very fortunate to be a part of this movement and part of this panel. Now, I have a few speakers that I'm going to introduce. And right now, I'm actually going to introduce by the name of Brother K.A. Owens. He will be talking about the justice for the murder of Breonna Taylor. K.A. Owens, a board member of the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. So
I'm here.
If
my mic is on. Is my mic on?
Yeah, I hear you, Kay. I hear you. Is that
all
you?
Right, all right.
Go ahead, Kay. It's all yours.
Glad to be here with you, brothers and sisters. I'm K.A. Owens. I'm on the board of directors of the Kentucky Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression here in Louisville, Kentucky. And what it's like here in Louisville, I guess most of you know that Breonna Taylor, 26-year-old Black woman who was doing everything right in her life, was killed by Louisville police in her home on March 13th. And since May 28th, protesters in Louisville have been marching. We've been out in the street. Our headquarters is kind of Jefferson Square Park, which is surrounded by the Hall of Justice, the county courthouse and city hall, and the jail. The first night of protesting, 7 people were shot by persons unknown. Then National Guard was called in later, went down to 28th and Broadway. Mr. David McAtee killed by the National Guard. We know because it was their bullets, 5.56, 223. And then a couple Saturdays ago, well, the Saturday before last, one of our people was killed by somebody that we had ejected from Jefferson Square Park, came back and shot one of our own people. So we've had casualties, but the young people, because I've been in this thing for 20 years, the young people that are out in the street every night that are in caravans, 200-car caravans going from downtown to the East End, that's where the white folks live, and back. And we've got young people, white and Black, who will march from downtown Louisville to the East End and back. These young people are changing the world. That is, on the second night after we were out in the streets, the mayor decided he was going to prohibit no-knock warrants. And then the Metro Council passed an ordinance preventing outlawing no-knock warrants in Louisville. But that's only because people were out in the street. We're out in the street, and that's what's making it happen. It's these young people, I tip my hat to them. They do things differently than we did 20 years ago. Good. New leaders are developing, every day. Good. The young people are organizing things on social media that old folks don't know about. Good. So what it's like here in Louisville, I'll tell you what it's like. Every day is like a week. Every week is like a month. We're making history every day, but the difference between reading history in a book, you read a book about World War II, you know that in 1945, the Allies win. But when you're living history, you don't know who's going to win. So, uh, so that's what it's like here in Louisville. We don't know what's going to happen, but we're doing the best that we can. I mean, there's disputes in the movement. I know those of you on social media. I'm actually not on social media, but the young people call me up and read me the post. So, you know, so yes, there are disputes in the movement. But there were disputes in the movement 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 40 years ago. It just played out a different way. So, you know, we're doing what we know how to do the best way we know how to do it. I just got off a Kentucky Alliance board Zoom call because everything is Zoom now, y'all. You know that. Everything is Zoom. You can be on a Zoom call every day, all day if you want to. And so one of our board members was saying have to be like a mid-30s-year-old male. He said, is it all worth it? Because he feels like we can't control the Jefferson Square Park. And, you know, and people say, well, we can't control anything. The street is what we got. I mean, the Kentucky Alliance had 3 or 4 tents down at Jefferson Square Park. We were sleeping there. And then the police came in when Mr. Tyler Girth got shot and killed down there and cleared out our tents. So we still go down there every day. Everything starts and ends from there. I mean, we can't control everything that happens, but it's the energy from the street. Right. That is the Jeff Davis statue came down from the Kentucky State Capitol. Wouldn't have come down without these kids out in the street. The General Castleman statue came down from Tyler Park. Wouldn't have come down without these kids out here in the street. Everything, the energy, legislation is changing. The governor, I mean, the mayor's put more money in the budget for black folk, you know, allegedly it's supposed to help black folk. It's because of these kids out here. So, and some older folk, and it's white kids too. It's not just black kids now. And so, and there's older folks joining in. So, and now how do we take this energy?
Okay.
Am I going on too long, brother? Let me know.
Yeah, bro. Yeah, bro. Yeah. If you could just wrap it up right now, because we're kind of cutting it short. Very insightful for a very good report. But if you could just wrap it up.
I've enjoyed listening to everybody, and in Louisville, we're just going to keep doing what we know how to do, the way we know how to do it, and I'm sure everybody else across the country and the world will too. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, gracias, hermano, K.I. Owens. Thank you so much, man. Thank you for reporting that from the streets of Kentucky. Thank you so much. And let us know and follow up and stuff on the Breonna Taylor case. Now, I'm next on 2 speakers I want to introduce them both. Actually, organizers, they actually organized a rally last month at Bergenfield, New Jersey. So her both names are, her name is Chelia Phillips and Vanessa Amoa. Chelia Phillips is an activist and organizer for POC Bergenfield alumni and for Change Bergen County. And Vanessa Moore is a Ghanaian American 24-year-old graduate student fighting against racial injustice and part of the POC Bergenfield alumni and for Change Bergen County organization. So my dear sisters, the virtual floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. So the one thing that we really wanted to touch topic on is the protest that we had last month in our hometown. And the one thing that really struck a nerve to us is the full-blown police presence that was there. Because the week prior, they had another protest, but I guess it was organized with the council and with the mayor and everything. And it was just like, I guess, a happy, good time kind of protest. But for ours, since we resisted that police presence, and we didn't want to have any affiliation with the local government. They showed up in a police bus and they let out approximately like 30 officers, and then they had the cars stationed everywhere throughout the town. And it really made me and Vanessa think, you know, why would they do this to us, and how are we much different than last week's protesters? And I think it's simply because we didn't want to comply and we didn't want to be a part of them. And while we were having our speeches at the police station, and we saw the way that the police officers' mentality and the way that their stature was while we were speaking. It was very nonchalant, and they really seemed like, oops, excuse me, did I cut out? There we go.
I see you. Go ahead.
Okay. The way that they handled themselves overall just seemed like they didn't care, and I think that's the issue throughout this whole country. And someone had mentioned earlier how like our police system is us versus them, whereas in Cuba they are a part of their community. And I think that in itself says a lot about how we view our civilians and our police officers as separate. And at the end of the day, you know, when police officers go home, they're regular people as well. And it also makes me reflect about the Stanford prison experiment. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but for whatever reason in our country, when we put random people in power and we give them this position of officer and we give other people the name of prisoner, they abuse their power. So I don't know if it's like that for Cuba in itself, just because I don't have that much knowledge about Cuba, but that's something that we should, I guess, try to implement over there to see if they will have the same issues that we have over here just by that experiment within itself.
Yeah, and just to give a little bit of background on our protest, our town is predominantly white. So the people in the town stayed inside, they boarded themselves in their house. They didn't want to hear what we had to say. But we were out there and we were loud and they had no choice. So it's very powerful for us because we grew up there. We were usually the only Black kids in our class, usually the only Black kids around the town. We're usually isolated and ignored by parents, teachers. So this was huge for us. It was like telling them that we matter and we're here and you can't ignore us anymore. So it was very important for us to just get that point across and make sure we had that protest in our hometown.
Right, and to piggyback off of that, you know, we could really see the officers that truly didn't care that we were protesting about police brutality, George Floyd, and Black Lives Matter, because, you know, they just were looking up into space, didn't want to be there, or, you know, just overall just being very careless.
Yeah.
So overall, just to wrap it up, I think that our little experience last month with our protest was really, I guess, a wake-up call for us for something that we, I guess, haven't directly experienced. And thank you, everyone, for having us. And I enjoyed listening to you guys all.
Yes, thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Chelia. Our next speaker right now is Pacey Hackett. She will be reporting. She's an independent activist. She's an anti-corporist and pretty much an activist. Knowledge of the ills of capitalistic system for years. Currently involved with two workers collective, the Bay Area Amazonians, and the TCEOW, the Committee of Essential Workers, which is led by Chris Smalls. So, Pacey Hackett, yes, if you're up next. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Cesar. Hello to everyone who is joining in. I appreciate you watching. We all do, of course. I just wanted to give a short commentary on the protests that I have personally witnessed and also of those that have gained nationwide attention within the US. As the world has been watching, there'll be little surprise from listeners regarding the updates of just the Los Angeles, California protests, starting with some of the first protests set up in California following George Floyd's death. The cops, of course, were armed in riot gear. They used drones to capture photos of protesters and had helicopters above each group. LA County is one of the worst offenders in the country when it comes to police brutality, and protesters knew there was a real chance of being either harassed, arrested, or detained. And of course, by dusk, that's exactly what happened. I personally had rubber bullets, tear gas, and flashbangs shot towards myself and other protesters in the midst of an otherwise peaceful protest. Throughout the nation, there's also been healthcare workers against police brutality protests of several hundred organized by doctors and nurses. It was a march and rally to the city jail in that city demanding healthcare, not cages, referencing our immigrant brothers and sisters suffering in immigration facilities to this day. And also in Aurora, Colorado, a vigil was held for Elijah McCain, which was disrupted by the police in a calculated effort to harass peaceful protesters, many of them kids, while playing the violin in Elijah's honor. And Elijah was a violin enthusiast who died in police custody in 2019 following a brutal arrest. And the participants of that vigil were pepper sprayed unprompted by the Aurora PD. And observing all of these things that are happening, it was very reminiscent of the protests of 6 years ago, and 5 years ago, and 4 years ago, and last year. These protests are all sparked by the killing of unarmed Black individuals by our police. And while other countries experience very little, if any, severe documented police brutality, it is unfortunately a regularity here in the US. Our police here are on average undertrained for many of the calls they are expected to respond to, hence the call to defund the police, which simply equates to the reallocation of funds to institutions that will serve the community much better. And with training from city to city and state to state of the police being all over the map, plus the militarization and lack of accountability, this has weakened civilian trust for decades in them. And lack of their training for the types of calls that they are brought in to respond to results in them using the same solution regardless of the issue they are called to respond to. And their solution is always violence and or imprisonment. And as the nation has been watching and comparing ourselves to outside individuals, we see in Britain and New Zealand, for example, police on patrol do not carry guns. Australia and India, where the police on patrol are armed. However, they have, like the other countries mentioned, very little to no police killings. And the same with Cuba. Again, it's no comparison to the dismal report of the USPD, which is why there are no George Floyds in Cuba. The US, at minimal, should seek to emulate our neighbor, Cuba, instead of constantly attempting to marginalize you. And some of your comrades here, including myself, are in the fight to bring attention to that fact, and that the US oppression does not end in the US, and nor should our outrage stop within the US. There is a true global movement happening, and everything's on the table here. So we do continue to stand with you in solidarity in your fight. And again, I appreciate all who have been here to hear this message. And I want to thank all of the participants as well. The information has been sound and helpful, and I salute solidarity to all in attendance.
Gracias, Pacey. I think we have one more speaker, but I don't see him. Mark Ginsburg. No.
So we don't
No.
have Mark
No.
here?
Mark Ginsburg, if you're there, please say something. I just can't see. Okay. Well, I guess not. I guess that we would just have to. Unfortunately, I don't think he might be able to make it. Something might have happened, but I'm pretty sure he might have a good reason. But I guess we'll just go pass it off to the co-chairs.
Thank you so much. This has been very, very inspiring. Do you have any words, Kennedy?
No, this has been amazing. It's always a pleasure to hear people from all over the world, and we're all forwarding and making this movement better and bigger in our own little ways, as it should be. So it's just, it's an honor. It's speechless, honestly, to say the least. But I think we're moving on to our Q&A now, right, Jamila?
Absolutely. And there's been quite a few questions. So we're gonna ask as many questions as we can. So one of the questions actually came from Facebook, so I'll ask that one. How do the Cuban people vet each police officer? And that is up for anyone to answer.
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, absolutely. How do the Cuban people vet each police officer?
You're also more than welcome to do the raise your hand if anything as well too.
Would you like me to answer it since I'm the one who raised it?
Yes, please.
So I'm going to answer briefly because it would require a much longer conversation to understand the full situation. But you have to understand that the Cuban society is organized block by block with CDRs, Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. So through that organizational structure, when people want to serve as a police officer, the local community has some say-so in whether or not that person psychologically, behaviorally, background-wise, disposition can be entrusted with the people's security. Do they have the personality, the commitment to the people, the commitment to the community, the commitment to the revolution, such that they should hold that very important role in society? That is my short answer. I could go on for much longer, but we have a very short period of time for Q&A, so I'll just leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Yeah, we have about 11 minutes if we're going to hit the 2-hour mark. So here is another question. How can the Cuban model inform the current struggles taking place in the US, such as the struggles for BLM, socialism, Pan-Africanism, environmental justice, against prison, imperialism, etc.? Should I ask that again? I can.
Yeah, I think you should.
Okay, thank you.
And then any of our panelists, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, or if you wanted to chime in, please do so.
How can the Cuban model inform the current struggles taking place in the US, such as the struggles for BLM, for socialism, Pan-Africanism, environmental justice, against prison imperialism, etc.?
I can quickly take the Pan-Africanist piece if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
So I would say, for those that may not know, Pan-Africanism is the movement for one unified socialist Africa. And we're on the ground all over the world fighting to create that worldwide fighting force of African people to achieve that. We believe that until Africa is free, no African anywhere will be free. And so the answer to the question directly, as I spoke to earlier, is that Cuba, by virtue of its social revolution, its ability to have elevated people above profit, has served as an inspiration to the world about how to build a revolutionary process, how to build a mass revolutionary process. As Sister Sophia mentioned, using the committees in defense of the revolution to build on a geographic area, block by block, to build people, to ensure the education is happening, ensure the work is taking place. So that's the model that we use, and a lot of that is informed by what we have learned from the Cuban Revolution.
I'd like to add to that. Thank you, brother. And I think my Cuban comrades would say quickly, study what the Cubans have achieved. The Cuban Revolution is shaped and molded to address the needs of the people there. Similarly, whatever structure we wish to create in the United States has to be molded to meet the needs of the people here. So it's not simply a transference of the Cuban model. Certainly learning how revolution is built, how a better society is built is important. But we have to also understand that there are certain realities in Cuba that created a foundation for the kind of revolution that exists there. There's certain realities in the United States that create a foundation for the kind of revolution you want to create here. So it's important to study and then engage in the hard work of building brick by brick. It's not easy, it's not cookie cutter, and it is what some words I loathed when I was much younger. It is a protracted struggle.
Thank you. This question is specifically for Yanette. If Yanette can explain the relation between the CDRs and the local police. Are the police accountable to CDRs as representatives of neighborhoods?
Do you hear me?
Perfectly. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this question. Well, it has to do with the origins of the CDR. I mean, the Revolutionary Committee of Defense and the police itself. As I was referring in the my first explanation, the origins of the police has to do with the close relations with the society. And as properly Mrs. Elijah was explaining, the society is organized mainly in CDR. Well, what I will say is that the police and the CDR, even though are two different institutions, I mean, the CDR are a mass organization that belongs to the system, political system of Cuba, and the police is the law enforcement agency. In the specific role of the prevention and prophylactic functions that the police is doing in Cuba, in that specific moment has very, very close relations with the CDR. In general terms, the police is not accountable to the CDR, but since they are very close relations, they exchange information. I would say this is mainly in the grassroots levels that has to do with what is called the chief of the police sector, and also the police is part of the commission of preventions that are in the society. Those are the moments when they have more closely relations in these functions of prevention and prophylactic roles.
Thank you. Have a couple more questions since you have 5 minutes. So someone asked, what is the role of the judiciary in Cuba, including the Supreme Court there? How are arrestees in Cuba provided with lawyers?
I can take that question.
Thank
you hear me?
Yes.
Well, the role of the judiciary in Cuba, as in any other countries, is to dictate justice and to respond to the offenses that are committed in the society in general terms. It has been, I mean, the system of Cuba is informed by principles that are established, first of all, in the Constitution of Cuba, but also in the legal, I mean, the procedures laws. Regarding I'm trying to be quickly because we are running out of time. Regarding the way that lawyers are assigned to the authors of offenses, it's by our principles as well. You can take different ways. You can hire a law from the organization of lawyers of Cuba, but also it's also an important thing to highlight from our system, if you do not have the possibility, the chance to hire a lawyer, ex officio, you are assigned one. So you are not going to the courts without your defense. It's a principle of the defense in Cuba that is, I mean, the Cuban system is very jealous of that. So nobody appears to the court without a lawyer. If you are not allowed to hire one, you are assigned. You can choose ex officio, one of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to extend massive appreciation to all of the panelists this evening. And as an organizer myself, I learn something every single day. And I'm so grateful for this experience. So I want to pass the mic to Kennedy as we have these last few minutes to make announcements.
Okay. I was under the impression that we might be able to extend this a little bit past 10 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in case there are any other future questions that we wanted to bring. But before we get back to those, for people who are unable to stay with us past 10 Eastern Standard Time, we do have donations. We are organizing webinars and conferences at no fee, depending on the health and safety of situation. We are planning to bring speakers from Cuba and internationally to the International Conference for the Normalization of U.S. and Cuba Relations in November 2020 in New York City. And to bring the conference into people's local communities digitally, we are fundraising to make this possible. This conference will work towards the normalization of U.S.-Cuba relations and an end to the cruel and unjust U.S. blockades on Cuba. And then there's supposed to be, I think we have a picture of our donations and where you can donate. We also are part of a Saving Lives campaign. Saving Lives campaign is an initiative of the Canadian Network on Cuba, the National Network on Cuba, and Le Table de Conservation et de Salud de Quebec, Cuba. Specifically, we call for allowing U.S.-Cuba Canada medical, clinical, and scientific contribution, including inviting Cuban medical brigades to provide direct medical assistance and/or to provide advice and guidance in treating. Incorporating Cuba's interferon alpha-2b recombinant in clinical trials in the U.S., Canada, and the WHO, and granting by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval for Cuba's interferon alpha-2b recombinant. Ending U.S. economic and travel sanctions against Cuba, including its extraterrestrial nature and attempts to stop all other countries accepting Cuba's medical brigades and assistance, and ongoing measures that prevent Cuba accessing and importing medical equipment and medicines to confront COVID-19. The link will be posted in the Zoom chat. All right, and I think we are going to be back open to our Q&A. I want to say we had that open on the screen for anyone who is open to donating or is available to. We do welcome it. We have some of our information posted, hopefully in the group chat as well as, or in the group chat, in the Zoom chat. And
Thank you. Now, here is a question. What are the panelists' thoughts on the demand by some Afro-Cubans to take down the statue of former President Gomez because of his role in the racist killings of PIC in 1912? And I will ask that again. What are some of the panelists' thoughts on the demand by some Afro-Cubans to take down the statue of former President Gomez because of his role in the racist killings of POC in 1912?
May I say something?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm not a Cuban, but I just wanted to make 2 points very quickly. One being, I would like to thank and express my appreciation to all of the panelists for taking their time to give input to this panel and to this discussion. I think it was really vital. And as an African-American man and as an African, I feel that there is racism shown, if there's inhumanity shown by any man or woman, be they Cuban, be they anyone throughout the international world, they should not be stood up as praised in the form of a statue. I think that at best they should be put in an antiquated museum, because racism and classism and imperialism are things that we should not in any way show appreciation for, but should try to put behind us and move on to a more socialist type of society. So that's my input to that question.
Thank you. Are there any other panelists who have a response to this question?
Sure, if I could just say something. Just pretty much what Nesbitt mentioned. As we see the statues actually collapsing and falling being pulled down by protesters. We need to understand too that even though it's a very powerful symbolic gesture, they rip out these statues, these races, whether the white supremacy or colonials, like colonists, colonial empires and stuff. We need to understand to define the actual problem itself. And in many cases and stuff, it's a systemic racist problem. We have to talk about class. We have to understand that, that there are different levels of racism. So when I gave my presentation, as the movement keeps on intensifying, we have to understand too that racism along with that will intensify as well, because police retaliations are practically doing their best to undermine the movement. And we have to be on point and pretty much on the front line, standing in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters, like Black Lives Matter movement.
Can I say something, Kennedy and Jamila?
Yes, go ahead.
Quickly. I think it's important to understand that Cuba, like any revolution, has its own concrete conditions that led to the revolution. The key thing about Cuba is not so much as a model as it is an example. And it's an example of what happens when you actually make a revolution, because the police, as our panelists have gone into and given some of the history, were built from the bottom up with a different class character, because there had been a social revolution. So the police in Cuba is part of the oppressed, sort of like the first one now will later be last, and the present now will later be past. So this is important to understand. It's an example, but each struggle will throw up its own examples like that, and we can learn from the internationalism of the Cuban Revolution in that sense.
Thank you. Have another question. This is specifically for August Nimtz. And someone was wondering if you would be able to take on an active role in Minneapolis in the development of replacing NPD with community policing, or CDR, in order to ensure knowledge of Cuban policing and how it can be utilized for radical change of the NPD as opposed to the capitalist status quo reform. And should I ask that again?
Yeah, no, I think I heard, and as I just said in something that Sister Sophia said earlier, yeah, we can't simply graph the Cuban experience onto the U.S. experience. Just as the Cubans had to uproot the police system that was in place within Cuba, this is what we will have to do in the United States. We will have to uproot it. I'm prepared to be a part of any kinds of educational discussions with people to help people understand how the Cubans did what they did. So I'm open to that and willing to share those lessons of the Cuban Revolution to help us to go forward and understand the role of the police, what has to be done, what is to be done, not only in Minnesota, but elsewhere in the United States.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to, as we struggle, I wanted to be clear, there's no widespread recognition among young people and Austin and others that we need to fight white supremacists. But there's one thing to protest, is another to build a movement. And we need to be able to engage the working class in struggle. Young people need to know that no matter how many people are out in the street, to really win big transformation and change, you need workers. We need to organize in our own name, independent from the Democrat and the Republican Party. So what do we do now after we capture the attention of the ruling class and the world? We have to begin to organize and move to seize power, to win real change. And that type of change means fighting for transitional demands like defunding the police, like removing police union from a central labor council. But defunding is our first great step. And
I totally agree. I totally agree.
And speaking of that, there's a question. Was the police union voted out of the AFL-CIO in June?
Is that a question to me?
That is a question.
In Seattle, not the entire AFL-CIO, but in Seattle at the Martin Luther King Labor Council, yes, they was expelled. They're not part of the Labor Council. And right now, we're in the process of meeting with the leadership of the Labor Council, and I'm talking the constituents group, like the AFL Randolph, this Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, APALA, and all these groups of color are going to be meeting with the leadership of the Labor Council and trying to work on beginning to work together and building something that's going to start eradicating some of this racism within the labor movement, because we have to be clear on this. Leadership in the labor movement are not all on the right side of this movement. There are many of them are still sitting on the wrong side of the fight today, because racism is still embedded in the heart of America and in the heart of the labor movement. We have to fight within to eradicate that, and it's not going to be easy because it's been going on for years. And labor, a lot of the leadership on the labor movement, many of them come from that KKK mentality and white supremacy mentality. Let's be straight up on it, you know, and they speak truth to power. That's what it is. And even within our union in general, we fight, and that's why I'm glad to be part of the ILW, because we're not afraid to fight, whether it be in within or outside of our union, to try to change.
And so there's another question I was asked similar to that. What is the best way to move forward in unions?
The best way to move forward in union is to find farm organizations that are willing to work and organize the workers within. And the main thing is education. People need to be educated because they need to understand that the civil rights struggle is the same as the labor struggle. If they destroy Black people, the next thing that will be coming is for working class people. And you know what? Blacks play a pivotal role in supporting labor. And if that is gone, labor is gone as well. So people need to recognize that. Our white working class brothers need to recognize that this is not only our fight, it's also their fight. And the lack of education is seriously needed to get people up to date on what's going on in this class struggle and their contribution, because we are responsible as a labor movement to commit to this struggle and this fight. We have a responsibility, I should say, because we clearly understand the meaning of slavery. It was about free labor. It was clearly about free labor. And what working class people are fighting for today, it will never happen without the civil rights movement and the struggle and the life that I've lost by Blacks all the way to today. And I would have to even bring up something that I think we need to do. There's three things that we need to do. Break the iron nexus between police department and district attorney, because we know that's a problem. And then launch a national policing, the police movement. And then from local community to committees of safety. So that means we have to build a committee of safety. Because we have to understand that the police get away with the murder because the district attorney does everything to cover up and delay the processing of making police accountable. And we got to, and it's a whole game. You got to understand that also
Just so you know, we have a few more minutes.
Okay, so I'll stop here so I don't take over.
Thank you.
Can I just say something quickly to that?
Yes, yes.
If possible. So, I work for a labor union. I have for over a decade. So I understand totally the concept of labor and the struggle for justice for oppressed colonized people is the same struggle. But I also think that we have to be mindful of history, and we have to look at our history. Like, this country has a history. If you look at Tom Watson and the development of the Populist Party at the end of the 19th century, a lot of African people joined that party under that message of populism. And once the Tilden-Hayes Compromise was signed and the South went into segregation, Tom Watson joined the Ku Klux Klan and terrorized our people for the rest of our lives. And our experience in the Democratic Party and all of these capitalist parties is not much different. So yes, we need to participate in labor unions, absolutely, but we need to organize ourselves in these labor unions, and our indigenous Latino family members need to organize themselves, LGBTQ people need to organize themselves, women need to organize themselves, and anybody who truly wants justice is not going to see that as any type of threat. It's just all of us being properly organized so that we can work together better and stronger on a larger level.
Thank you so much. We have one more question for Sister Sophia, and that is, give an example of 2 Cuban police policies that impressed you.
Okay, I don't know if you would call this policy. I'll speak about practice. What I observed was that when the police engage with the citizenry, one, they're polite, they are respectful, and I have no problem saying that I visited Cuba literally for decades before I was able to recognize an arrest on the street. Because what I was familiar with an arrest looking like in the US was an aggressive, physical, humiliating, physically assaultive experience. An arrest in Cuba looks kind of similar to a discussion about a baseball game. And it was my Cuban friends who finally pointed out to me once, well, Sophia, there's an arrest right over there. But it was so non-confrontational that it had a major impact on me, because prior to being there, I never knew that an arrest could happen any other way than an absolutely humiliating experience, having been arrested myself here in the US more than once. Another thing that impressed me was that the police really want to be trusted and embraced by the community in the way that they engage with the people in the community. And they take great pride in trying to do their jobs in a way that the community will embrace and appreciate them. But that's not my experience here in the US. Also, that the police there come from the communities where they are policing. It's definitely not my experience here in the US. And I've lived in several different states, and it hasn't been my experience in any of those states. So those are a few things that I'll speak to the practice of the way I have seen policing done in Cuba. And as I said, I've traveled all over the country, and I've visited well over 80 times, and I've never seen an aggressive arrest in Cuba.
Thank you so much. And once again, I want to just really send my appreciation to all of the panelists this evening. And I'm going to pass the mic to Kennedy.
Thank you, Jamila. Really appreciate it. It was such an honor co-hosting with you, as well as all of the panelists. It's been an honor. My ears are here. We are always here, building, working, making sure that our people are done right to and are doing the right thing, out of love and peace and respect. And, I just, want to give my love to that. And so right now we are going to do a few announcements. We have an announcement for November 14th and 15th, an international conference for the normalization of US-Cuba relations and ongoing work of the group. To get involved, The email is info@us-cubanormalization.org. It should pop up on the screen soon. Again, we encourage people to get involved in their local communities. You can find a list at us-cubanormalization.org/viva. Going on forward, I guess we'll pull it up soon. It'll be posted in the chat as well. July 18th and 19th, it's a concert for Cuba. Concert is for Henry Reeve Brigade Nobel Prize campaign, and to, it is the Henry Reeve Brigade Nobel Prize campaign, and to raise awareness against the US blockade on Cuba. There are 20 to 22 musicians from Cuba over 2 nights asking people to support, which would be on Twitch. I guess it's Hot House Global. That's July 18th and the 19th, the concert for Cuba. Save the date, August 13th, International Celebration for Fidel Castro, featuring speakers from Cuba and around the world, organized by the US-Cuba Normalization Conference. Again, we want to thank all of the speakers and participants, Allison Bodain, who we don't see, Cheryl, all of them who are helping out behind the scenes, and all of the panelists, and everyone who came and had questions and spoke within the chat. So thankful, so thankful. And we hope that this all gets to you, and that this is, a continued effort, and we continue to do what's right. So wanted to put that out there, and we urge you to continue to connect with us. Hopefully we have some of our US-Cuba normalization group information on the page, so some of you guys can take it down. And please join our newsletter to stay in the loop. And have a blessed night, be safe, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Solidarity.
Viva Cuba.